This podcast originally aired in June of 2020. Please enjoy this rebroadcast. Tariffs, coronavirus, Hong Kong unrest. China's been in the news a lot lately. So today, we're going to take a look at China and try to make sense of what's going on there. Welcome back to another Future Tech video podcast. Today, we're going to turn the conversation to Asia. Now, there's been a significant rise in the influence of Asian countries on the global stage, and some of it's hard to make sense of. So today, we have a very special guest who can help us make sense of all that is going on. Andrew Dougherty describes himself as a China Economist-Rapper making sense of the Riddle Kingdom one rhyme at a time. Andrew is a China-based economist polymath who is smart as hell and has a huge wealth of knowledge about Asia. And he raps on top of that. Andrew uses rap to help educate people around the world about China. You can find his latest album at theredprintalbum.com. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, Chris. Good to be here with you.
And as usual, I have Sandesh Patel with me.
Hey, Chris, how you doing? Hey, Dougherty. Well, I was so excited that you were coming. So I went online and I thought I'd buy myself a special shirt, to honor our alma mater. And I was so excited. It was like Christmas came early. Only one problem. This is the size. So
yeah, man.
Yeah.
You're gonna have to get in the gym, bro. You're gonna have to get in the gym, lose some weight.
It's gonna take a little bit more than the gym, I think, for that.
Yeah. Oh. Thanks, Chris.
All right, so Andrew, just go ahead and explain China to us, if you could. That'd be great.
Yeah, it'll take 2-3 minutes, I think.
Just a couple minutes. Hey, so I just want to start off with a little bit of a quote here from the statistician Hans Rosling from his 2018 book, Factfulness. If the UN forecasts for population growth are correct, and if incomes in Asia and Africa keep growing as now, then the center of gravity of the world market will shift over the next 20 years from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Today, the people living in rich countries around the North Atlantic, who represent 11% of the world population, make up 60% of the level 4 consumer market. Already by 2027, if incomes keep growing worldwide as they are doing now, then that figure will have shrunk to 50%. By 2040, 60% of level 4 consumers will live outside the West. And then he goes on to say, people in North America and Europe need to understand that most of the world population lives in Asia. In terms of economic muscles, we are becoming the 20%, not the 80%. We also misjudge our importance in the future global marketplace. Many of us forget to behave properly with those who will control the future trade deals. So, I mean, that's a pretty powerful statement, right? That, what we've known as sort of the global economic standard is really shifting to Asia. And I think we've seen a lot of evidence of that movement. As an economist, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's absolutely true. I mean, you alluded to the fact that we've already seen that shift take place in a significant way. So in what way? Well, on an absolute level, China is now the second largest economy in the world after the United States in terms of nominal GDP. The U.S. Last year was $21.5 trillion of GDP. China was around $14 trillion. So still a bit behind the U.S., but on a PPP, purchasing power parity basis, where you sort of try and neutralize the effect of cost of living and things, China actually was ranked first. That's a theoretical concept, but it's one that suggests that China's rise has been beyond anyone's expectations, even I would say the Chinese. I mean, I remember when I really kind of started as an economist about 12, 13 years ago, working for my firm based here in Hong Kong. At the time, China was certainly behind Japan, I think behind the UK. This was in 2006-07, and Germany. I mean, it was sort of fourth or fifth, and then quickly surpassed those, and eventually surpassed Japan and became number 2, and has kind of crept closer to the United States over time. So in absolute size, it is significant. Now, the balancing act is that China likes to still sort of be considered a developing country because it talks about, look, on a per capita basis, we're still a middle income country, we're still developing, and that status gives them some beneficial treatment versus if they were to be considered a developed country. And so there's still a tension in how the world considers China and Asia's rise. But there's no question, you're absolutely right. It is about a shift in economic influence. And with economic influence, by the way, and we can get into this, comes geopolitical and other types of influence that makes this shift pretty complicated, a shift to manage on a global basis.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that we've seen a rise in China's influence around the world, geopolitically, like you say, at the same time that the United States seems to be declining a bit in that regard. What are your thoughts about what is China? I mean, I think China's already stated that they want to be, a global superpower or the global superpower. I mean, is that sort of their focus right now?
Yeah, I think they phrased it a little differently, but there's definitely an aspect of the Chinese identity that reflects what you're talking about. And Xi Jinping, very early in his new tenure, enunciated what he called the China Dream. Sort of sounds like the American dream, but the China Dream, among other things, included the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. That's the sort of the translated phrase, and so it's a recognition of, from China's perspective, of their return to that Middle Kingdom status. That whether or not they're the only superpower or they share that stage with the United States for some time, but they want peer recognition with the United States, and they want within their own country that sense of identity that we're back and we had a 200-year sort of breather. And there's a lot in Chinese history books that focus on the influence and involvement of foreign powers and holding them down during that 150, 200-year period. And so there's also sort of a sense of angst and revenge maybe is too strong, but there's a sense of wanting to sort of show the arrogant Westerners that you don't know so much, and after putting us down for many centuries, we're back and we're going to sort of stake our claim on the global stage.
Yeah, and I don't think as Americans, I think a lot of us consider China sort of like a third world nation, which they're not really. They're not really a third world nation. The scale of China and its economy is massive. I mean, I know that there's more middle class people in China than there is the entire population of the United States, right?
Yeah.
So help us understand like what that scale is like.
Sure. So the way to understand China's economy is to think of it as a continental economy. So if you think about its population, you have 1.4 billion people in China. Mm-hmm. The size of the landmass is as large as the United States plus Alaska, and maybe a bit more. So it's when you look at China vis-a-vis the U.S. and Europe, has a larger population than both of those combined. You could add another United States on. And kind of get close to what China has population-wise, and in terms of the middle class, you're talking about a consumer class of probably out of 1.3 billion people. Depends on how you want to define that income level, but let's say roughly 400 to 600 million people. Certainly conservatively, you could say 400 million middle-class consumers in China, which, as you suggest, is larger than population of the United States. Internet users is, I don't know the most recent number, but it's probably close to 800, 900 million internet users. So just multiples. And what you get when you get middle class consumption-led societies, you get innovation. Really, innovation is driven, you guys know better than me, is driven by consumer demand and needs and interests, and companies innovate to sort of find ways to meet those needs. And so China has started transitioning in the last decade or two away from the kind of copy, manufacture, low value add stuff to, starting to innovate around the margins, and in some sectors really push innovation in a significant way ahead of maybe in a leapfrog sense. And so that's also helping transition China from this kind of lower lower income society and economy to a service-led, away from manufacturing towards a service-led economy where incomes are higher and the consumer class is driving the economy in a way that looks a lot more like the United States or Europe. So the last thing I'd say on this is if you go to any of the top 20 or 30 cities in China, you would not get an impression that this is a developing country. It's going to look actually cleaner and newer, and the infrastructure is better than anywhere in the West because all the airports are 10 years old, train stations, subway stations, etc. So there's a newness to urban China, which is where most of these middle-class consumers live, that is remarkable when Americans come over or Westerners come over and visit for the first time and say, wow, this is not what I imagined when I think of communist China. So you're absolutely right. However, if you go to the countryside, then there's 600 million people still living on very low incomes. In fact, the premier, they're supposed to have accomplished this year, 2020 was the year they were going to end poverty in China. And it was very controversial recently because Premier Li Keqiang recently came out at the party congress, the meetings recently, and said, well, we still have 400 million people living on, I think it was 1,000 renminbi a month, or 1,500 renminbi a month. So, not very much money, a couple $100. And that sort of sent shockwaves to the system. Like, wait, I thought we'd solved poverty. And so there's still a lot of folks that are struggling. But so you have, as I say, continental economy is the way to think about it. You have almost it's a tale of two economies within one country.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things there that I want to touch on. First, going back to an earlier comment you made about the middle class and the innovation that brings, that's a thing I think that's really interesting. I'm old enough to remember the rise of Japan, right? In the old days, it's like, oh, the cheap junk from Japan, right? And then it's like, then they started building things that were copycats of what was being made in the United States. And then all of a sudden, they started coming up with all these incredible and innovative products. And it's like, wait, what happened to Japan? Japan's like the finest quality of stuff that you can go and get, right? I see that sort of thing playing out a little bit with China too. There's some incredible innovation coming out of China. I use DJI stuff, and the drones and the gimbals and all the stuff they make is top of the line, most innovative stuff in the market, right? So there's clearly something happening there on the innovation front that I think most Americans don't understand, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I would just give a few more examples of that. So first of all, as incomes rose and as wealth creation became more broadly accessible and entrepreneurship continued to sort of expand in the system, you had more and more Chinese returnees or overseas Chinese studying in the United States or elsewhere getting PhDs coming back for business opportunities. I mean, Baidu, which is the Chinese version of Google, was started by Robin Lee, who got his PhD at University of Buffalo or SUNY, one of the SUNY universities in computer science, came back and founded, this search engine that is now, a massive tech company in China, the Google of China, effectively. Yeah. You have a Tencent, which runs a social media app called WeChat, which is, frankly, it's like the combination of all the best apps in the United States, all in one. It's this incredible platform, and so you can. Alibaba is another one, which is sort of the Amazon of China, but with other aspects to the platform. So you run across the internet space in China, and there's been some really interesting innovations. And by the way, like if you go to Beijing and you're walking around Beijing, and there's these rural Chinese farmer types that are in Beijing selling the fruit that they grow. And these guys don't make much money, and they're selling you fruit. They nowadays prefer that you pay them using WeChat Pay on the phones rather than using cash. Yeah, so there's almost no, and a lot of places won't take debit cards or credit cards anymore. It's either WeChat or cash, or Alipay or cash. So China is light years ahead in terms of fintech and financial payment systems versus Europe or the United States. Even Hong Kong is a far more cash-based economy than mainland China. So there's some interesting kind of leapfrog dynamics there that have come out of this innovation in key sectors.
you mentioned like Alibaba and Baidu. And I mean, when we look at, reports on like the cloud and things like that, Americans sort of don't, count them in Tencent. And, I mean, these are huge entities that are absolutely rival their U.S. counterparts. So I think that's something people don't always realize. But I want to get back to another point that you made earlier about, sort of the middle class, but there's also this second economy in China that is fairly impoverished. It seems like there are two different, economies in China. And I think also when we look at China from a power perspective, Beijing has control over a certain portion of the country, but a lot of it sort of falls outside of what Beijing's area of scope of control is, it seems, right? And everything seems to be focused on sort of those major population dense regions. I mean, is that your perspective on it too? And how does that dynamic play out in China?
You touch on a millennia long challenge for the rulers of China. This went back into the dynasties, and there's a Chinese phrase that translates roughly as the mountain is high and the emperor is far away, which effectively means it's very difficult to govern such a large country, both geographically and in terms of population. And, China has often looked at Singapore and Singapore's rise, this authoritarian country that effectively is looked at as this wonderful kind of, even though they're authoritarian and there's no real political freedom there, they're looked at this as this fantastic, rise of this nation state. And so they study Singapore and they look at Singapore and how did they do it? And, well, Singapore is a 4 million person city. Right. It's much easier to govern. So to your point, that's a real challenge for Beijing is how do you control the provinces? The Communist Party has attempted to address that experiment by a massive party organization, which is 80 million, 90 million people large. So, so maybe 7% of the population, 6-7% of the population are party members. And then they have party organizational units all the way down to the village level. So at the village level, there are party chiefs and party committees. And so there's this system of reporting up. Now, historically, that hasn't meant that the locales and local governments always listen to Beijing when they want them to do something. And there are policy tensions there that range from fiscal to environmental to other categories. So it's not easy still. But I would say it's getting slightly easier because of technology. So monitoring in the system, not just within the party, but broadly in China, is getting a lot easier with these high-tech security cameras, facial recognition, AI, and those technologies are being employed all across China, initially in the urban centers. And then, maybe most importantly, there's a social credit scoring system that the government introduced some years back, which Alibaba is using their databases to help with. And that system is used to basically assess whether any citizen is a good citizen. And if you're rated as a bad citizen, and again, there's a lot of categories that can impact that, including, by the way, who your friends are on social media and what kind of posts they post. So you have to be very careful. You have to sort of curate your friend group so you're not friends with anybody who's posting anything that gets taken down, because that'll hit your social credit score. But if your social credit score goes below a certain level, you have to pay fines to the local community organizers, and you might not be able to buy train tickets or plane tickets to travel. Or get mortgages. So it's like our financial credit system, but expanded to basically how everyone behaves.
Social credit system.
It's a social credit system. And by the way, they're just starting to they started introducing that a few years ago. What's really interesting, they're just starting to introduce a corporate credit system. So this is a corporate social credit system. So this is going to get really interesting for multinationals who are going to have to figure out, as this thing gets applied across China, how effectively what's happened with Zoom recently. How do you be a good corporate citizen in China and not look like to the rest of the world that you're kowtowing to a government whose values are very different from your core markets?
Yeah.
But that's a separate issue. But China's efforts to manage, just to sort of come back to your original question, China's efforts to manage society are going to largely be tech driven in the future. And I think they'll find it a little bit easier to do that. But in a system of 1.5 billion people, you're not going to manage that completely.
Well, and it also begs the question, there's been such consistent GDP growth in China year over year that I think the population has been pretty content with the government in the sense that, all ships are rising with the tide, right? And eventually there's got to be a limit to that, right? And as you get increasing wealth disparity in the country because of that dynamic, you got to imagine, there's going to be both people who are going to be discontented from not participating and people who are participating who feel like they should have greater freedoms or perhaps less monitoring. I mean, how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. What you're alluding to is what the social contract is. And, just kind of reflecting on Trevor Noah's recent comments about social contract in the United States and how that is broken. And there are aspects of American society that are coming out to demonstrate against that fragile contract, which is not working for them.
Black American people watch time and time again how the contract that they have signed with society is not being honored by the society that has forced them to sign it with them.
That's exactly the same situation in China. Yes, it's a one-party state, and people are not allowed to speak out against their government. But actually, there's a long history of protest in China, not just the big ones like Tiananmen Square that everybody's familiar with, but even over the last 20 years, local protests when local government officials have been found to be corrupt or have treated someone poorly or have absconded with funds or whatever it is. And you'll see mass protests at the banks, if that's whoever the culprit is, the government office buildings, and Beijing has to manage those very carefully. And so, yes, there is an increasing wealth gap. Number one. Number two, there is increasing tension and angst in China around some of these social issues. But as a result, Beijing has been pretty focused on addressing those. What are the key issues? Well, corruption was the number one issue for decades after China opened up. What did Xi Jinping do? He came in and he launched the largest anti-corruption campaign in Chinese history and was largely pretty successful, not at eradicating corruption, because you're not going to do that in a system like China, but at pushing it underground and throwing a lot of people in jail and arresting a number of party officials in a way that made the people feel like, okay, the system feels like it's at least a little bit more fair, even if a lot of that was politically motivated. The second thing they've done is they've declared a war on pollution, on the environment, because that was the second thing that was plaguing everybody. The air is so bad in China, and they've actually made some decent progress on that. You have to give them some credit. They have a long way to go, but they're making progress.
Well, and they're becoming a leader in clean energy tech too. That's another big area of innovation for China. So yeah.
That's right. They're a huge leader in clean energy tech, and that gets to another topic, which is Chinese industrial policy. But I would also add food safety, which is and health and sort of the health system, healthcare, insurance, because they had the irony of this communist society is they had the worst health provision system and healthcare social security system for its population of any major country in the world. And so they've been building that up over the last decade or two to provide at least a minimal level of care for everyone in the country and try and improve food safety. Although obviously with COVID-19 and the coronavirus and question of some of the origin of that with the markets and the animal trade, maybe they haven't solved that. But they've been making progress on those issues. And so generally, what's the quick and short answer to the question of how they manage that? So far, they've been managing it fairly successfully. Most Chinese people, if you canvass them or survey them, are fairly happy with their government. And if you were to suddenly turn it into a democracy, you'd probably see a Russian-style democracy where the same guy wins every time, in part because people like them and think the government's doing a decent job, and in part because they have control over certain media and government bodies.
Yeah. In talking about, Chinese control, right, and sort of their desire to have greater control over the population, I guess. One of the things that strikes me as a little odd is that during, we're facing a global pandemic right now, and they go into Hong Kong and try to sort of upend things in Hong Kong. And at the same time that's going on, there's also challenges in the Himalayas, right, with conflicts between India and China, where they're having fistfights on the border, which is sort of an odd one to me. But we see sort of and then there's Taiwan and their expansion in the South China Seas. I don't typically think of China as sort of expansionist in that regard, but they do are we're seeing sort of some expansionist sort of things going on here. What's your take on what's happening there?
Chinese foreign policy really had a significant shift when Xi Jinping took over. Prior to that, Deng Xiaoping's guidance when he was in charge in the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, his guidance was that we, meaning China, should hide our talents and bide our time. Let's take it soft and slow and easy and find our way back and not ruffle any feathers to get anybody focusing on sort of our development in a way that feels threatening to the rest of the world. By 2012-13, when Xi Jinping came into power, he took a bit of a different approach. And as he enunciated in 2013, that the China Dream I alluded to, which was really about China's rejuvenation and reestablishing itself on the world stage, that included a new type of a foreign policy that was bolder, a bit more assertive. So what did they start doing? Well, when he met with Obama in Sunnylands, California, which was in 2013, I think, there was a request from the Chinese to sort of be acknowledged as equal partners on the global stage. They started making stronger claims in the last 10 to 15 years about the territory in the South China Sea, as well as this 9-dash line, which they sort of have Chinese military leaders have drawn in Asia, kind of along that island chain up through Taiwan, around Taiwan, and up to the southern coast of Japan. That area is all effectively under Chinese influence. It's almost like a Chinese Monroe Doctrine. They're saying, look, this region is either Chinese or will be under Chinese influence, and we're sort of setting the world, and particularly the United States, we're putting you on notice to that we're not going to tolerate U.S. dominance in Asia. That provoked, of course, the pivot to Asia. To some extent, I would say, the pivot to Asia by the Obama administration, which sort of materialized, but kind of not, and it's failed a bit. And there was a lot of criticism of the Obama administration's handling of China, that they were too engaging, and China took advantage of that. Trump came into power and said, hey, for whatever you think about him as a person or as a president, one of the things he's gotten right is he acknowledged and recognized that China was taking advantage of the United States and other countries in terms of their trade relationship, but also some of the geopolitical issues, cybersecurity, cyber attacks on the United States, imbalance in that relationship. We do espionage just like they do, but the Chinese do espionage on behalf of state-owned enterprises. So there's corporate espionage that's done by the state in a way that we don't, right? So there's a whole list of stuff that the U.S. government and bureaucracy was frustrated with that really hadn't been addressed, because there was this effort like, we want the Chinese in on environment and green energy and things like this. So let's give a little bit over here. And Trump came in and said, no, we're not doing that anymore. And very quickly developed a bipartisan consensus in the United States around, yes, we need to start confronting China on a raft of these different issues, which is what's led to the U.S.-China relationship becoming so fraught and tense these days. Right. But China has not stopped in the meantime being very assertive and aggressive. And I would say, although Trump created directionally this move to confronting China, he also sort of started targeting all of the United States allies at the same time for a variety of reasons. And so there was not a very strong multilateral strategic approach to handling these issues with China, with allies. It was very bilateral. And so the Chinese, so that's the first thing. And then secondly, the Trump administration gave up a lot of space that the United States had historically filled globally in terms of soft power, democratic values, global governance. And as a result of that, the Chinese have taken the opportunity to sort of expand their presence either in international organizations or in the region, sort of militarily or geopolitically. Then you add, lastly, and I'm sorry for the long answer, but there's a lot of elements here. You add, finally, coronavirus. And in the middle of coronavirus, you have a Trump administration that is on its back footing, trying to handle what's happening in the United States. The rest of the world is in the middle of the same thing. The Chinese have gotten a lot of flack for that, and that's going to take a long time to recover from. But there's a vacuum. And so my estimation, and different people have different views on this, but my estimation is Xi Jinping is taking the opportunity during effectively this time of global chaos to advance some of his goals, security and otherwise, in the Asia Pacific region. Hong Kong, all of these things, by the way, from a Chinese perspective, are sovereign issues. Mm-hmm. Hong Kong is Chinese territory, and that legally is true. There's no argument around that. I mean, Taiwan, you could sort of try and argue, but Hong Kong, there's no question. And so,
although there's the 50-year agreement, though, too, right? I mean, and so they seem to be falling back on that.
There's the 50-year treaty of a one country, two systems situation, but within that, there's a lot of room for interpretation.
Right.
And for example, in the basic law in Hong Kong, it does stipulate that that Hong Kong will legislate and create all the laws for Hong Kong, but with the exception of things around sovereignty and national security, where if Hong Kong isn't able to legislate those issues, Beijing can help or support or intervene. And that's what they're doing.
Right.
So from Beijing's perspective, this is well within their mandate and right, even within that agreement. And number two, very recently they came out and said, there's no legally binding, document that says we have to do these things. We agreed to this in principle because we think it's the right approach, and we still want Hong Kong to have economic freedoms, all these things. But it's part of the People's Republic of China, so we don't want Hong Kong citizens making fun of the national anthem or desecrating, the national symbols or the flag and all these things. They have to behave like the rest of Chinese citizens do when it comes to social and political issues. And it was sort of a lot of egg on his face last year with all the protests in Hong Kong, and it was bad in terms of managing tensions at home. You didn't want that to spill over at home, but also it was bad for him within the context of elite politics in China, where a lot of his enemies were that's a pressure point. Anything that makes him look bad, there's an opportunity for opposition within the political system in China to push against him. And he has a lot of enemies, having done a lot of stuff during the anti-corruption campaign that put people in jail. So let's just say he's paranoid just generally. And when you have things like the coronavirus overstepping international or geopolitical relationships in ways that have made some people in China nervous, the situation in Hong Kong, these are all pressure points where his enemies and system can push against him. So he's taken the opportunity to say, look, there's chaos globally. Let's go into Hong Kong. Let's get this thing through. Enough is enough. We're going to sort that out. Also because, by the way, Taiwan, the situation with Taiwan and the relationship there is getting worse because of what's happening in Hong Kong. So let's show that we can have a firm hand, but still have a good economy, and still, they want to kind of create a Singapore model in Hong Kong. Yeah. I don't know if I'm not sure they're going to succeed, but that's the goal. In India, same thing. Like, we can fool around with the border in India, which has been a decades-long conflict, and nobody's going to care except the Indians.
Yeah, although to me, it just, especially when we think about sort of China's loose control of mainland China, it seems like they may be stretching themselves a little too thin on too many fronts right now, because you got to think, Hong Kong's could create huge backlash. A lot of these things could stir up a lot of backlash that they're going to have to deal with on multiple fronts. It seems like, I get, the sort of the paranoid nature of what's going on, politically, internally in China, but it seems like it puts the whole system at a bit of risk. But maybe
that's a good question, and I think it's a fair point. That the counter argument is that Xi Jinping is engendering a significant nationalistic fervor in China. So the Hong Kong thing, I think most Americans, I'm guessing, would think, oh, the Chinese people must be looking at Hong Kong and cheering them on for this democratic movement to work so they can import it. Quite the opposite. Yeah. It's had exactly the opposite effect. Most Chinese people are saying, who are these ungrateful Hong Kong citizens who pay lower taxes than we do, don't have to, fund the military, don't have to serve. I mean, they have all these wonderful things, and yet they're complaining, and they have freedom of speech, and yet they're complaining about a little National Security Act. And so in China, that's been a win for Xi Jinping because he's been able to turn that from a propaganda standpoint to sort of engender more nationalistic support of the government. India, conflict border, same thing.
Yeah.
Taiwan is part of China. That's 100% a Chinese perspective across all 1.4 billion people. Nobody believes Taiwan should be independent. Right. So all of these conflict areas, which do create, you're right, they do create risk and geopolitical tension with other countries, which can cause some risk for Xi Jinping politically if he were to mishandle them. Yet they generate political capital domestically with his base in a way where sort of Trump does the same thing, right? He distracts from some issues by engendering some fervor among his base around other issues. It's a classic politician's move. So I think Xi's calculus, and I think he's probably right, is that as long as he doesn't overstep in these conflict zones, he gets the benefit of the nationalism and the support at home without really creating any kind of sustainable conflict. Now, where he might be miscalculating is all these microaggressions are leading, especially on the back of coronavirus and the blame China's getting for that, are leading to new ways of looking at China from the Europeans. Australia has been getting more and more nervous about China, as has Japan. And so if the United States gets a little bit more effective and strategic and proactive about its handling of some of these issues on a multilateral basis, that could really become an issue for China in terms of how they're agitating on the margins with all of these countries.
Another interesting dynamic to this too is, besides sort of their kind of domestic politics and expansion, they've been really aggressively pursuing markets in places like Africa and things like that. Securing mineral rights and things like that. They've been very aggressive going into some of these more developing areas and staking a presence out ahead of a lot of the European and Western nations.
Yeah. So again, this is part and parcel of Xi's more proactive foreign policy. He announced I think it was 2013, One Belt, One Road, which eventually became known as the Belt and Road Initiative. And that's this sort of, let's recreate the old Silk Road concept of trade. And that will also sort of parlay itself into geopolitical relationships, military bases and outposts, and other strategic benefits. And so he started investing in, lending to, and increasing trade with all of these countries. You mentioned Africa, the Middle East, even into Europe significantly in some Southern European and Central European countries. The Chinese have become much more active. I mean, on Africa, just to give you some sense for what they've done in Africa, they've invested over $300 billion in the last 15 years in Africa. And some of that's pure investment where they take equity stakes in a project, particularly most of their investment has basically been in infrastructure and natural resources. So they'll do equity investment in these natural resource projects to ensure secure supply of all sorts of minerals and other natural resources that are important for China, and then they give loans to these governments to build infrastructure, oftentimes required, by the way, for the shipment of these raw materials to China, but railways and ports and other important infrastructure, airports, and then they'll send in the Chinese construction companies and transportation, railway producing companies, and so they'll get Chinese job generation out of it. Excess capacity from these Chinese companies can be effectively, in some ways, shipped to Africa or these other countries that they're working with in Asia, Burma, Malaysia, etc. And so they have this sort of relationship that suddenly becomes quite disentangleable, because you have a debt profile and a debt relationship, which makes it difficult for these African countries to extract themselves. And so there's been a lot of criticism now of China, including the fact that these Chinese projects, they're not setting up manufacturing plants to a great extent and employing Africans at a high level. Chinese employment of African labor in Africa through Chinese investment is like 1.75 people to $1 million of investment. It's much in the rest of the world. It's like 2.3 or 2.4. It's much higher. So there's it's an unsustainable level where you get all this backlash from local populations, and eventually, after the initial euphoria and the honeymoon period, that the governments appreciate all this investment, then they start to get frustrated as the local population's not getting employed or treated the right way. So the Chinese are going through a very similar evolution as other Western powers have in terms of investing in these developing countries. But they're using it to their advantage. I have a friend who works for the U.S. government at USAID who does a lot in this space. And he says that the Chinese are going to these countries, where the U.S. has pulled back considerably from a financial standpoint, but they're still offering sort of governance and other consulting services, and saying, hey, democratic values work, and there are other things we can help you with. And then the government say, yeah, but the Chinese are giving us 10x what you're giving us in money.
Yeah.
And so it's a difficult game to play. Last point I would make, though, is UK and France, obviously ex-colonial powers in Africa, still invest more on a dollar basis than China. So China has grown incredibly quickly in terms of its presence in Africa, but still isn't the dominant player yet.
Well, and Russia's made some big inroads there too. So it's going to be interesting to see how all that plays out. But what you're saying about Chinese investment, it's not just in places like Africa. It's like places like Wisconsin with the Foxconn plant where they got billions of dollars of incentives, and then just nothing materialized from it. So clearly they're struggling with that globally in first world nations as well.
They're very good at doing deals where they get access to natural resources and they acquire a company. Even then, integration can be challenging sometimes. But when it's but they're not as good at the kind of public relations soft power aspect of integrating in their organizations in other jurisdictions and markets. So it's something they're trying to learn and they're getting better at, but it's going to take a while.
So, one of the things, so Sandesh and I were talking, the other day in preparation for this, and, he's saying, like everywhere I go, there's some like rich Chinese people, on vacation, buying up all this stuff and, living it up and stuff like that. And, when I say, well, there's a huge middle class, it's not a surprise that they're traveling. There's a lot of money in China these days. So it's not a surprise that, there's just, a huge presence of Chinese all over the place. So I think the thing is like it comes into conflict with sort of Americans' perspective of like what China is and what Chinese people are like. What do you think that Americans should understand about China and the Chinese?
My question really was, what I was saying to Chris was, when I go traveling with my wife, we were in Paris for her 40th birthday, and we were going to these fancy stores. It was her show, so we're going to these stores. These Chinese ladies are buying purses that are $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. So is a middle class person in China able to afford those kind of purses? Like from an American perspective, like my perception is, man, these people are all loaded. They have so much money.
Yeah, Chinese wealth is it's hard to understand. I'll say, even having lived there for lived in China for over 10 years. I see things like that, and I'm still amazed. So, you're not alone. That's the first thing I'd say. But to explain it, there has been a massive rise in China's economic success and the wealth of the population in China. If you have 400 million middle or 500 million middle class Chinese, then you have 10 million super duper rich Chinese and like 100 million pretty rich Chinese. And so just the law of large numbers, you go to Paris and you see all these Chinese, because that's a drop in the bucket of the total population of China. That's number one. Number two, Chinese love conspicuous consumption. And this is not unique to China. Most cultures that go through these rapid economic development phases, when you get a using the old French phrase, the nouveau riche base of consumers that haven't had stuff and then suddenly can afford it, the natural inclination is to be conspicuous in your consumption. That's not unusual. And actually, since the anti-corruption campaign, you've seen a little bit of that kind of dissipating because it's less politically popular to be so conspicuous. But that's a natural evolution for any country going through what China has been through. And then the third thing I'd say is Chinese tax rates. This is a bit nichey, but Chinese luxury taxes, for example, and just the prices that companies like Louis Vuitton charge in China historically have been sky high. So between the luxury tax and just the price that these companies know that they can charge, it's been, you can finance your trip to Paris, all expenses included, by going and buying those bags in Paris. And so, because the price differential is that significant.
Wow.
And then there's probably one other element of what you're seeing there. Most of the consumption there is for self, but sometimes you'll have, there's actually a pretty healthy trade of arbitrage trade, not just in luxury handbags, but in cosmetics out of Korea and other jurisdictions and other products where Chinese will go and then they'll bring them back on shore and sell them for a higher price because they can get them cheaper in those countries. And so, and then actually the last aspect that a lot of these companies have to be careful about is a lot of these buyers will come in order to take handbags back to copy them and sell fake versions in China. So there's a lot of reasons why there's rich Chinese people in Paris buying expensive handbags, but the bulk of it is just legitimate. There's just legitimately been a lot of wealth created, on my album, the second song on my China rap album, the Red Print album website that was mentioned is a song called Billionaire. And you know the old Bruno Mars song, Travie McCoy song, I want to be a billionaire, so freaking bad, right? So I rewrote that song about the nouveau riche in China, and it kind of explains the culture around splashing cash and so that's that's not going to go away. Chinese are only going to get wealthier from here. And I've said to my wife, we got to get to all the hot travel spots in the world you want to get to now, because in 10 years, this is going to be a doubly packed,
Yeah. So what you're telling me is that Crazy Rich Asians movie is true.
It's true. And yeah, it's definitely true. And I would say if you thought Singapore is extreme, Hong Kong is even more extreme. And there's a lot of places in China that are as well. So yeah, Crazy Rich Asians is 100% truth to that.
What is something that, you being an American living in China for this long and just learning about all the cultures, what is something that, a perception that many Americans might have that you would correct?
I would say, I don't think they want to take over the world. That's the first thing I would correct. I think they want clear dominance in the Asia Pacific region in time. And I think they want respect as an equal superpower on the global stage. That's probably their ambition at this point. And you can be a little sympathetic to that, to the fact that they are the second largest country in the world. They are the largest country in their region. And, if the United States had Chinese bases in, let's say Hawaii wasn't American, they had Chinese bases in Hawaii and Mexico. They had an alliance with Mexico, and they had Chinese spy planes flying off the coast of San Diego to run, espionage and intel collection missions. The United States probably wouldn't like that either. And so there's a justifiable sense of we want to reestablish dominance and control in the region around us. Now, what's illegitimate about that is the Chinese haven't proven that they're able or willing to engage on a global governance basis and a kind of a global stakeholder model where they're treating other countries in a way that is reasonable and according to the rules of the game. They want to rewrite some of those rules. And so most countries are not comfortable with China taking on that. Vietnam, another fellow communist country, not very friendly with China and is actually butting up to the United States for that reason. So the Chinese would need to change how they approach their fellow Asian peers in order for them to get more acceptance there. But they don't really see the United States global order as one they want to sort of fully commit to or buy into. So one can accept that. Look, we understand a little bit why they're doing what they're doing, but maybe the way that they're doing it is not exactly a way that we are comfortable with or other countries are. The second thing I'd say that is a misperception is people think of China as this, authoritarian one-party system, very communist. Again, from a lifestyle standpoint, you go there, you wouldn't notice 95% of the time that you're in a communist country. You'd feel like you're in a capitalist democratic, maybe not democratic, but in a capitalist country. You wouldn't notice the politics unless you saw sort of the military soldiers guarding a few things here and there, but very little presence. And the second thing about this one-party state is I think oftentimes they all think the same. That we even analysts like myself who understand this a bit more will lazily say the Chinese. Well, in fact, yes, it's a one-party state, but there are factions within that political party. A lot of voices, different points of view, and a lot of political infighting. I mean, if House of Cards would look like Sesame Street compared to Chinese politics. So there's a lot of intrigue and back channel fighting and conflict in the Chinese system. And then the last thing I'd say is, there's a lot of headline conflict between the United States and China right now. Let's remember that on a personal level, like person to person, the Chinese and Americans historically have gotten along phenomenally well. And there's a lot of comment, like Chinese are super entrepreneurial. They're very optimistic. They're very friendly. They're super welcoming. And some of my best Chinese friends are as loyal and as close to me as any friends I have, from the United States or elsewhere. And so they're fantastic people. And so we have to be able to hold, and this is very difficult, especially in our world of kind of social media echo chambers, we have to be able to hold contradictions in our hands at the same time, that we can disagree with the Chinese government and the Chinese, but we can still love the Chinese as people and as friends and as a culture that is remarkable. So that's the other thing I'd say to remember.
So one of the things that I think that you do that's really, really interesting is you've created this rap career for yourself. Beyond being an economist, you've got this rap persona going on as well. But the thing that's cool about it is your songs are sort of educational for people in the U.S. to understand China better. And you've done some really interesting things. For me, there's a lot of like cultural things that are in your songs that I didn't really understand. I mean, just you have that one funny bit, about the babies with nothing blocking their bottoms, just sort of walking down the street, and if you don't like it, that's just the way it is, man.
Yeah, babies on the prowl, defecating on the pavement. I just want to scowl, saying, "So why don't you save it?" But that's the way it is. That's how we do it here. If y'all don't like it, you're welcome to steer clear.
Tell me about your rap career.
Yeah, man. Well, I got to get in person here, get in my persona, and also represent Hong Kong here. This is the Hong Kong flag here, so I got my Hong Kong hat on, represent my piece here. But
nice.
Yeah, no. I got into rap a long time ago, kind of accidentally. I mean, I grew up with Sandesh in high school playing basketball in Chicago, kind of basketball culture and hip hop in the '90s, and I was a musician, but I was a classically trained violinist. So it wasn't that relevant, but it trained me how to it trained my ear quite well. So how to make sounds and replicate sounds and understood rhythms and things. And then I got a little bit more into rap, and then started doing some parody raps just for fun for my university and for some, school events and then work events. And so when I landed in China as an economist, I thought, there's so much stuff that I'm learning and reading about and writing about. Why not make a song or two about it? And so my first one I wrote was about Beijing. And, this is a city where I've been a student learning Chinese and then returned as a professional. And I just wanted to write an ode to kind of the city I grew up in China. So I used Jay-Z's Empire State of Mind and wrote it about Beijing State of Mind, did a video, and it was super fun. And then that ended up turning into a 21-track album of songs all about Chinese kind of political culture, social culture, and the economy, and it was largely focused on kind of the last 10 years during Xi Jinping's rise and reign, and explaining what was happening in modern day China, because so much change was happening, way more than had happened in the previous decade or two, and rap is such a great way, music in general, but in particular, rap is such a great format for storytelling and education, because not only is it memorable, because you have these famous, I did parody, so I would cheated. I use famous rap songs everybody knows. But rap is so much faster in terms of lyrical production than a regular song. Yeah. So you can tell in 3 or 4 minutes, you can get into a lot of detail on like China's economic business, economic model, or policies around 5-year plans, or anti-corruption campaign, or how multinationals are faring in the anti-monopoly campaign, like really weird geeky stuff. And then on the social side, how do Chinese youth deal with the challenges, both men and women, gender issues, educational issues. There was a song about pollution, Tupac's Changes, all about how Chinese people want to change in the environment. And so there was so much to do. I wrote probably 5 or 6 songs about Xi Jinping and his anti-corruption campaign and who he was as a leader for the Chinese people. So it was just a fun way to kind of express what I was learning about and hopefully create a platform for people to, as you say, to kind of learn about China and do it in a fun way. So I know a bunch of university professors who have, started using it in the classroom, and that was kind of the idea, is just to use it as a medium.
So I guess the bottom line is, if you want to understand China, you want to be prepared for the global economy of the future, you got to go to the redprintalbum.com and listen to the whole album there, and you'll be a Chinese expert.
There's actually on that website, I will say, so it's mostly about China, but if you're not interested in China, there's a bonus rap video that I wrote about Trump when he was running in 2016. So a little crisscross jump parody for all those 1990s rap fans. So go check it out.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, I got to say thank you so much for coming here and sharing your wealth of knowledge about China. Really appreciate it. I think it's important for Americans to really get a better understanding of what's happening in Asia, because it is important, and it is the things that are happening there are significant, and I think it's great to see another global power rise and people improving their lives and creating incredible things, becoming entrepreneurs. I think that in the end, we're all going to benefit from that. So excited about it.
I think you're right. It's going to be a bumpy ride.
Yeah.
As each side figures the other out. But I do think there's a lot of benefit to a stronger China if we can work through those complications. And to your point, we as Americans need to. There's been such a multi-decade self-perception of Americans as number one,
right?
That I think we need to sort of recognize, like, it's okay not to be the only ones up there, and just because there's other people doing well doesn't mean we're not. And
it's not a zero-sum game.
It's not a zero-sum game. Yeah.
Right. Awesome. Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for watching. If you like what you saw, hit that like button. Click on that subscribe button, because that helps out a ton. And if you want to get notifications when we post new content, click on that bell icon. And I'll see you in the next video.